writes David Held, means a form of governance in which, in contradistinction to monarchies and aristocracies, the people rule. Democracy is often associated with parties and elections and voting, the core aspects of representative democracy, which means that the people do not rule themselves, but rather elect others to rule on their behalf. But is this narrow definition of democracy enough? Is voicing our wishes once every 4 years enough to make sure that the government does indeed reflect the rule of the people? To answer this question, we must take into account the fact that today's governments make so many decisions that affect our lives, much more than ever before. Recent studies show an exponential growth in the numbers of laws and regulations over the last decades in many countries. The expansion of regulation led scholars to coin the term the regulatory state to describe how modern states affect our daily lives much more than ever through regulatory agencies. Regulation, for example, includes the hygiene standards that our coffee shop must adhere to make sure that we don't get a stomach infection with our next cappuccino. Regulation also includes the rules that car seat manufacturers have to comply with to ensure the safety of our babies and our children in our next drive. To understand the immense and immediate impact of regulations on our life, think about how millions of people got access to a new vaccine the day after the regulator approved its safety. Unlike laws which are enacted by elected legislators, most regulations are made by and monitored by and enforced by independent regulatory agencies, which means that they are not part of the representative democratic system. This has led to claims that these are democratically deficient bodies. So how can we make sure that regulators are democratic, as in work in the interest of the public? This question is the focus of the first part of my paper, where I claim that regulatory agencies should develop democratic qualities. And what are the democratic qualities of regulatory agencies? I define them as mechanisms in the regulatory rulemaking and decision-making process that involve or give power to the public. I list 4 democratic qualities: transparency, participation, representation, and accountability. I'll explain each one in detail. Transparency means when regulators inform the public how do they make decisions, who takes part in their decision making, and why are their decisions and rules important and necessary. Participation means when regulators invite the public to comment on their ideas for new rules, and to make sure that the public interest is being considered. Representation, when the people that work in regulatory agencies reflect the diversity of the society. And accountability, when regulatory agencies report and justify their actions to the elected, either a minister or the legislative. Now that we know what are the democratic qualities of regulatory agencies, how can we know if our regulators have them? To answer this question, we need an appropriate measuring tool. Many measurement tools have been developed to assess the democratic quality of states. However, most of these measures overlook the regulatory process. Given the importance of regulation in our lives, this is a huge gap. In addition, there is an overlap between the concepts, which means that often when people say accountability, they also include transparency and participation, making it hard to measure them separately. So, to fill this gap, in my paper, I develop a measurement tool for the extent of which regulatory agencies are transparent, participative, representative, and accountable. To do this, I conducted a qualitative study of 6 regulatory agencies in different sectors and countries. I analyzed legislation, publications, and websites, and interviewed 33 regulators and stakeholders. I also built on previous similar measures. The outcome of this work is a measurement tool that can allow us to assess the extent of which regulators behave democratically. It can be found in the attached paper. What is novel about this tool is that it allows us to evaluate the gap between what regulators are obliged to do by law and what they do in practice. This is necessary since scholars that were interested in these topics focused either on the formal or on the practical dimension, which means that we do not know much on the gap between what regulators have to do and what they do in practice. But why is measuring the democratic qualities of regulatory agencies important? It is important for two reasons. The first, it can allow regulators to know where they can improve. For example, if a regulator is high on transparency, accountability, and participation, but low in representation, then hiring in a more diverse way could be a next step to consider. The second reason why it is important to measure is because we are wired to compare ourselves with others. And rating organizations is a proved way to motivate them to improve. It's like the saying, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and you can't improve it. As an example, we can look at Israel and how in 2019 it was rated quite low on the Global Competitiveness Report, specifically in the category that reflects how easy it is to open a business. The government, and specifically the previous Prime Minister, immediately reacted and announced that improving this is the government's next policy goal. And since then, the government is busy crafting a reform to solve this problem. Wouldn't we like to see such a motivation to change when it comes to the democratic quality of regulators? So let's conclude. Democracy is more than elections. It's also the extent to which our governments are transparent, participative, representative, and accountable. In the era in which we live in, where government power is exponentially increasing, it is even more important to measure the extent to which it's acting in the public's interest. To do so, I offer to measure the democratic qualities of regulatory agencies, or in other words, to measure levels of transparency, participation, representation, and accountability. I believe that measuring them is the best way to motivate them to become more democratic. The measures that I developed and presented in this paper enable us to do so, and enable us to understand the role of regulatory governance in democratic setting. Thank you for listening.